Quick word on the Europe's floods. The scientists were really great. They got onto this right away. Those floods were 19 times more intense because of global climate change. And this is the big advance in the science. And they were up to 9 times more likely because of global climate change, because of industrial greenhouse gas pollution.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. Today, floods of fury. It is currently early September 2021, and for most of you viewing, you're probably quite aware that we've had many extreme floods throughout the entirety of this summer. And in fact, where I'm reporting from here in New York City, I'm just a few days out from an incredible storm. Started out in the Gulf of Mexico by the name of Ida. Created a tremendous amount of damage in Grand Isle and Louisiana, moved its way up here to the Northeast. I'm happy to say that I did okay during the flood, but as you may be aware, a lot of people didn't. And you know, there's a story, this biblical story, a great flood on this planet that took place over the course of 40 days and 40 nights. Well, for many people, the story is apocryphal, but you know, we are not too far from living this reality when the world is going to be flooded and only a few of us may survive. You know, we're not going to have this giant ark to ferry us all to safety. What are we going to do? Well, here at the forum, we like to educate, because when you're educated and informed, you can make educated and informed decisions. And we've talked a lot about the warming of the planet and droughts and how that will affect us. But it's important to know that flooding is also a very, very big aspect of our warming planet. And in fact, according to the Climate Science Special Report, which was issued as part of the 4th National Climate Assessment, more flooding here in the United States is occurring in the Mississippi River Valley, in the Midwest, and in the Northeast. And coastal flooding in the United States has doubled. That is ×2 in a matter of just a couple of decades. And so there are so many factors that go into flooding. Yes, weather events, including rain and including storm surges and sudden snowmelt. But a huge portion of what we're seeing here in the United States and in a lot of urban developed areas in the world is flooding due to a combination, a confluence, if you will, of both heavy rainfall, or as some people term them, and it may even be a legitimate science word, rain bombs, when rain just pours out like buckets. So it's a confluence of that and overdevelopment of the urban space. People are so surprised when we see this increase of flooding, but ask yourselves, where's the water to go when it hits these impervious surfaces? What am I speaking about? I'm speaking about cement. What do we see all around us in the urban environment? We see cement. And when there's cement, where's the rain going to go? Normally in nature, when it rains, there's soil, grass, rain falls on this. And if there hasn't been a drought, it'll go into the subsurface and it'll feed the groundwater. Well, that's no longer happening. So increased urbanization is a great problem with these floods. And with the increased urbanization and the increased flooding, one of the things that's exacerbating this is not only is the urban space heavily cemented, but the infrastructure is failing. Some of you have seen the subways here in New York City that were inundated with floods. People, these subways were not built in a time of climate change. We are no longer able to accommodate the natural systems of the planet. And because of this, the 80% of the world's population that now lives in an urban environment is in great risk. And I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Peter Carter, who is very well versed in all of these aspects of flooding. And so, Peter, can you share with us more about this topic?
Yeah, thanks, Regina. So, of course, the first thing I thought about was the big IPCC Working Group Run report. And again, we now have the IPCC scientists and world government saying that the increase in flooding is definite, and that it's definitely due to what they call a human-driven factor. So floods is one of those several extreme weather situations in which everything is getting worse faster already, and it's going to continue to get worse faster. I would sort of challenge the scientists' use of human-driven. It sort of implies that everybody in the world is pouring out greenhouse gases and driving the planet to collapse. Well, that's actually not true. Oxfam has done regular studies, and the vast majority of the world's population hardly emits anything. You know, so human-driven means actually human-driven by us, human-driven by the industrialized global north. It means human-driven, and we should say fossil fuel industry, because after all, everybody knows that's by far the major cause of all the global heating. But of course, the politicians and the scientists have a trouble saying that word, fossil fuel industry. We've entered a new age. I think that's probably clear to pretty well everybody. And when you read that IPCC report, it's very clear. We've entered a new age of bad weather, and it's going to get worse. So the planet is becoming a hostile place to us, thanks to our industrial emissions. It's going to be a much less kind place to live on. So I was actually astounded. I went through yesterday picking up countries that had had disastrous floods this year. And, you know, we've seen the images, right? The word is flood. But the images we've seen, you know, are old people being ripped out of the arms of their sons and daughters who are trying to save them, little babies and children getting washed away as their parents look on. Houses collapsing, agriculture devastated, particularly in that massive flooding in Pakistan, for example, in 2010. So the list is absolutely astounding. Germany, Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Australia, but even Spain had a disastrous flood this year. Floods in Turkey, China, really, really bad ones that made the headlines in China, India, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the United States we're well aware of, even New Zealand, Mexico, Ecuador, Venezuela, Indonesia, Singapore, Japan. Japan had disastrous floods 2 years in a row. But then there's Africa, which tends not to get reported. Devastating floods in Sudan, in the White Nile state of Sudan, Uganda, Ghana, Niger, the Congo, Ethiopia, Somalia. The other thing I want to sort of quibble with a bit is, you know, how much can we adapt to this? How resilient are we? Well, we have adapted. There are proportionately less people being killed as a result of these floods. That's good, but there's still lots of people being killed. And there's a limit, as the IPCC says, to how successful we can be with adaptation. A quick word on the Europe's floods. The scientists were really great. They got onto this right away. those floods were 19 times more intense because of global climate change. And this is the big advance in the science. And they were up to 9 times more likely because of global climate change, because of industrial greenhouse gas pollution. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that world overview, Peter. And as you were reading off the various countries that had experienced these horrifying floods, I have to be honest, the images flashed in my mind of each country that I recalled seeing, and they truly are horrifying. And I do want to thank you so much for making that correction, which is so important, the human driven versus fossil fuel industry driven. Because I know for myself and for a lot of my friends, when we hear human driven, we feel badly, we feel responsible, we feel guilty. And I think it is important to recognize that it's the fossil fuel industry that has put us in this terrible, terrible situation. Paul, I would like to hear what you have to share on flooding.
Yes, so thank you, Regina. Thank you, Peter. So clearly flooding is impacting people more and more around the world. We're getting increases in the frequency, severity, and duration of extreme weather events, such as torrential rains leading to flooding around the planet. And the main reason for this, rapid uptick in flooding events and consequences is because the way that heat is transferred on the planet from the equator to the poles has been completely disrupted, because the Arctic in particular is warming so much faster than the rest of the planet, 5 to 8 times warmer if you go up to the high Arctic. Most people quote the number as, it used to be, they quoted as 2 times, but now I don't see that very often. It's 3 times, but it depends on how low you go to define your region as being the Arctic. If you go to lower latitudes and include more of them, then that ratio goes down. But if you're talking about the high Arctic, it's at least 5 times, warming is at least 5 times faster than the rest of the planet in the high Arctic. So this is because the Arctic is warming and the temperature of the Arctic is getting closer and closer to more equatorial temperatures, right? That temperature difference is decreasing. The jet streams slow down because they basically exist because of the temperature difference causing a pressure difference with latitude. So they slow down and become wavier in the north-south direction and get stuck in place. And where we have the strong ridges or crests of the wave, underneath those we have heat waves. We have very stable, hot weather, and that dries out, soil and things, causes heat waves. It's in the trough of the jet stream where we get very unsettled weather and storms. And those storms are essentially guided by the jet streams. So because the jet streams are slowing, those storms are moving slower across the surface of the Earth, and therefore dumping more rainfall on some regions and not reaching other regions. Remember, for every degree Celsius rise in temperature, the air can hold 7% more water vapor. And this more water vapor in the atmosphere is, as there's convective uplift of this water vapor, it condenses into the clouds and releases its latent heat energy, which fuels and increases the severity of the storms. They're also lasting for much longer because the jet streams aren't carrying the storms across the Earth as quickly, and the frequency has gone way up. So this is the world that we live in now. Now, think of things progressing and the Arctic warming even more and the jet streams slowing even more, perhaps even essentially vanishing or getting extremely weak, then a lot of the weather patterns in a given region will be affected by the land-ocean contrast or the topography. of the land, and we'll get more monsoonal-like effects. And when I think of a monsoon, I think of torrential rainfall when the monsoon is on. So it's sometimes with the intensity of the rainfall that I've been seeing myself in Ottawa and Ontario, it almost reminds me of a monsoon. I mean, it's very, very humid, you know, torrential rains. And of course, you know, any rainfall on the surface, you know, that water finds the lowest spot, which is the rivers and things, which are then swelling their banks and destroying infrastructure along rivers. Also, the hurricanes are stronger and they're behaving differently. So Hurricane Ida is in people's minds. It came up in the Gulf of Mexico and had very strong winds as a Category 4, I believe. But it didn't dissipate quickly. It took an awful long time to lose its energy because the ground was so wet that fed into keeping the storm intense. It made it to the northeast and caused huge amounts of flooding because it happened to collide with a cold front, which pushed underneath it. And that basically wrung all of the moisture out of the air like a wringer on a washing machine or something, and it dumped all of that rain in the northeast, causing huge amounts of flooding.
Thank you. I can attest to the dumping of the huge amounts of rain. Thank you for reiterating the fact that, you know, the warmer the temperature is, the more moisture can be held in the atmosphere, and therefore the more rain can fall all at once. And also the slowing of the storm system itself, which we very much saw on display with Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston not too long ago. So Peter, you had talked about the limits of adaptation. And I've been talking to my friends about where we can move to escape climate change. And, you know, even if we move further away from the coast, I have friends who have land upstate in New York away from the coast, but then you have the issue of inundated, you know, this extremely wet mud and landslides. So that whole issue of our limits to adaptation, I'm wondering if you might be able to speak a bit about that.
Well, clearly, we have entered, as I say, this new age, which is a disastrous age of extreme weather events, which is going to hit us everywhere where we live. It's going to hit us harder. And as Paul says, these events are going to last longer, particularly the heavy precipitation and the flooding. You'd have to spend a huge amount of money to adapt to these events, because number one, in the vast majority of countries, you'd have to massively upgrade all their public services, which in many of these countries are practically non-existent. So you'd have to do that. But you would have to also have an increase in infrastructure. You mentioned the problem with the concrete. That was particularly the problem with those poor people in China that got those horrifying videos that got stuck in their underground trains and the water was rising. So that is a maladaptation which would have to be fixed. But that's a huge amount of money. Also, there's another aspect to this, which relates to health services. Floods are associated with an increase in gastrointestinal diseases. When you have one of these huge floods, you get toxins of all kinds released that are being hanging around, you know, various people's houses, agricultural pesticides, stuff like this. But you also get multiplying bacteria, of course, spread around. And this is why with climate change, why we've said for decades that there's going to be a steady increase in gastrointestinal diseases and deaths amongst young children, which already is a major cause of children worldwide dying under 5 years of age. So climate change is going to increase that, and basically the increase is going to come from these hydrological events that wrecks, you know, our containment systems, our sewage systems, particularly in the poorer regions. But it's also happening in the major regions. So adaptation, you know, just think about those images that you got from Europe, right? Adaptation. There are very, very major limits to adaptation. So IPCC, they're pretty good, but they made a mistake when they said that adaptation can reverse risks of these extreme weather events. No. The best that adaptation is going to do is marginally reduce, right, the loss of life, particularly in an extreme event like heavy precipitation and flooding. But the health consequences are major.
Thank you for bringing that aspect of the health consequences into the discussion. It so often gets left out, but it's so incredibly important. And when you talked about the flooding and the toxins in the water, it just brings to mind, I grew up as a child in Houston, and we had these huge floods. That was the time when we kids got to go out and go swimming. And I just think of myself swimming in the ditches and in the streets, and we thought it was so much fun. And it kind of chills me just to think back on that. And I'm sure kids today throughout the world still take the opportunity to go swimming after floodwater. And how dangerous is that for the youth of the world? Really, really frightening. Paul, any thoughts on, I'd like to hear more about what you have to say about the causes and conditions that are bringing about these horrible floods that we're experiencing more and more of.
Yes, I talk about the climate casino. And when a city steps up into the climate casino and is unsuccessful, it's hit by some climate caused disaster, some consequence of climate change. So, think of Hurricane Ida. Okay, I mean, it devastated the coastline where it came ashore. It maintained its strength because it was moving over very wet surfaces, something, some people have coined a brown ocean. I mean, hurricanes extract energy from the seawater, but if the ground is extremely wet and warm, that evaporates a lot more water, which feeds back up into the storm, and it can be self-perpetuating to maintain a strong intensity. And then that carried off to the northeast, to New York. There's some regions that got 17 inches of rainfall, and that's 42 centimeters or 420 millimeters over a 24-hour period. And of course, when you're talking about that amount of rainfall over a vast part of the landscape, that water really has to go somewhere. And the ground was actually quite wet to begin with in the case of the Northeast. So it was saturated and couldn't hold that much more water. So when a huge amount of water falls onto saturated soils, it can't infiltrate into the soils that easily. So it of course collects in the low spots. It tends to turn highways and streets into rivers, essentially. I mean, we've seen that. So, how does the city deal? I mean, when I think of adaptation, I think, you've got to run as fast and as far as you can away from the climate thing that's happening, because, that's not what we're doing. I mean, I say that sort of jokingly, but, a city along a river is destroyed and then it's just rebuilt in the exact same spot. Maybe some of the buildings are a little bit higher. And not only does all of that rebuilding create huge amounts of fossil fuel emissions, but it costs a huge amount of money to the municipal governments, the provincial or federal governments, all levels of government, and the taxpayers pay. And eventually you have to ask the question, what happens when the insurance companies start going bust and can no longer cover? There's just too many disasters. There's just too many payouts. They go bankrupt. Then that drags the reinsurance companies under, which are the basically insurance companies for the insurance industry. And then essentially when these places are destroyed by catastrophic flooding or some other climate created disaster, some consequence of climate change in the climate casino, there's just no money left to rebuild this. So people just have to, abandon those regions. And, it's like we're getting more and more and more of these events. The costs are increasing exponentially. So the system is rapidly approaching and has already reached the point of breakdown, in numerous countries right now. It's sort of death by 1,000 cuts. The countries that have less money, that don't have as many engineers to rebuild things, they're suffering more than than richer countries in the West. But there's a limit. I mean, wealth isn't infinite. Eventually, these cities will be damaged and destroyed far beyond the ability to rebuild them. So this is a world that we're heading into as the Arctic continues to warm, as the temperature continues to rise, and as we continue to pump enormous amounts of to burn enormous amounts of fossil fuel. And the Earth system, the sinks of the Earth are absorbing less and less carbon. So the amounts are rising in the atmosphere and oceans, and they're, it's going to get a lot worse. We really haven't seen anything yet. We're just scratching the surface, and most people need to figure out, how serious and how bad this is going to be, and demand that we take action. Getting rid of subsidies on fossil fuels is vital.
Thank you, Paul. That was quite the quote. We haven't seen anything yet. But I must agree with you. The last time I was in Houston, which was last year, a lot of the houses, they do rebuild. It's interesting, but now the insurance has required that they rebuild in the lot, but 6 feet up. And then you got to wonder, well, how long is building a house 6 feet up above ground going to suffice? It is the casino situation. And I think we just need to get real. There are some mitigating things we can do, bioswales and things of this nature, and permeable surfaces, but it's just simply not going to be enough. And well, what would my take be for someone who's living in a floodplain area? Well, I hate to say it, but please consider moving. Oh, look what happened to the people in the coast of Louisiana. We could be next, any one of us watching this. And it's important, as I said, to stay informed, and that is our goal. And if you did learn something, I hope that you will like and subscribe and consider sharing this video with a friend as well. But with that, I'd like to thank Peter and Paul for being here, and thank you all once again for joining us in the Climate Emergency Forum. And we'll see you next time. Until then, stay well.